Welcome everyone, I'm Armen Minassian. Glad to be a moderator of Aurora Dialogues Online. I would like to begin by thanking for joining us from various corners of the world. I also want to express my gratitude to the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative for, in my opinion, organizing a very important discussion, and of course to Future Studios for hosting this event. I also want to remind the participants that they may submit their questions. The Artsakh war is what dozens of volunteer doctors participated in, and the diaspora doctors joined in as well. They didn't have to, but they had to. The White Army returned the life to the soldiers who did not fear death, forgetting that day and night, 7/24, their first and foremost objective was to save lives. A smiling soldier made the doctors go for unexpected risks and take those risks. The volunteers of the white-clad army were performing surgeries in rooms without windows or even without doors. We have an opportunity to communicate to 4 of those heroes from the White Army. From Moscow, a thoracic surgeon, Shagen Danielian. From Yerevan, General Surgeon Gevorg Grigoryan. From Geneva, cardiovascular surgeon Gregory Khatchatourov. And from LA, surgeon orthopedist Armen Hagopjanian. I hope that Dr. Hagopjanian already succeeded to join us. He's just out from the surgical theater. Yes, I'm online. Thank you. Our dialogue will commence by me asking several questions. These questions already include the most frequently asked questions by the audience, and I will remind you along the way. How did your household take your decision to leave for Artsakh? What was the toughest decision you took there? What would you suggest to a doctor who has encountered a traumatic event for mental health? And how major an issue was the post-traumatic stress disorder for the doctors that work there? What are the lessons learned and what new initiatives are out there? For example, the initiative of Dr. Hagopjanian and his friends, let's say. So, dear colleagues, since we know each other very well, I propose that we use first names. Shagen, how did your family take your decision to leave for Artsakh? Please. Welcome, everyone. My family went very emotional for the first time because I left for Artsakh during the war twice. And like with every Armenians, in the onset of war, there was a much larger enthusiasm in the beginning, which lamentably waned off over time towards the end. The second time, it was a much tougher decision. It was the end of October. Around then, the Gori-Stepanakert, on the right-hand side of the Gori-Stepanakert road, there were trenches and the bombs were exploding nearby, but it was impossible to pass another or a different decision. I, of course, understood that my family, it would be very bad if they were to be left to their own devices without me, but I would feel much bigger pain knowing that I'm just working and living in Moscow. There are young guys at war who need my help, but I'm not there because I took a more balanced or cowardly decision, which is why there could have been no other decision about this. What was the toughest decision you took while you were there? Before we get to the toughest, Armen, let me tell you that it was much, I've acquired a lot more positive things from the war than anything negative that I experienced, because I met during the war such good people that I don't have comparable experience through the rest of my life. This is both our young soldiers and the local people who stayed put throughout to the last day and did not lose their dignity. And the doctors, both from Yerevan and the local doctors, as well as all over the diaspora who arrived there, that was a marker that let me understood that the people who are there, you can only understand positive values, learning from them. As for tough decisions, like in any grave decisions, yes, the gravest decision would be there's a wounded person and you can't help them because you don't have the time for it. That is the most disgraceful. That's the rule of the war. There are 10 people wounded and you know you're not gonna attend to those 3 because by the rules of war, there's high probability they'll perish and you don't approach them. It's God saved our psyche from that pain. There were so many of us that this was not such a big problem. There were no wounded people that we wouldn't have attended to. Like they say, we were trying to save each and every wounded person, even understanding that a particular person didn't have much chances. And the gravest decision for me was, when in that last disgraceful day when Shushi fell. I don't know how it fell, but it did. And we were transferred in a very unnice way to Chaldaran. It was on the 7th. In a very ungraceful way, we were transferred to Chaldaran. There was a situation there that after this flight, after this evacuation, there were these discussions that some people from among the doctors should return to Stepanakert. I already understood that the issue had been resolved for good because through the most recent days, I saw that when there was someone getting wounded from the so-called special unit, there were half a dozen or 7, 8 people carrying him to the medical outpost. I understood that the people were in a very distressed psychological condition. I took a decision understanding that it was meaningless any longer. I didn't get back to Stepanakert since there was this question that 1 or 2 groups of doctors should go back. And I didn't join those groups, knowing that some friends of mine with whom I spent 4 or 5 weeks there did get back to Stepanakert. The war was no longer there. There was no big influx of the wounded. There was not much to do there. But the fact that I did not return with them looks like I left them and went to Vardenis 1 or 2 days before that ugly document was signed. That was the heaviest decision for me. Since you referred to your colleagues who are in the Stepanakert hospital, I will request that you mention as much as possible the names of medical professionals that you had worked with. Well, in general, in Stepanakert, there was very brilliantly organized hospital in Stepanakert. In Moscow, in Europe, in Russia, I've seen many hospitals, but the Republican hospital in Stepanakert, their emergency ward is a very high-level emergency room, hinged on specific people, nurses, doctors who were doing their work not 5 but 10 plus. 3 minutes after receiving a patient, every professional specialized decision that had to be taken was taken. Both the tests, the vitals, the radiation exams, I would like to commend the entire staff team of the Stepanakert Hospital. Brilliant people, surgery nurses, emergency doctors, local surgeons, very high level, devoted, dedicated. They stayed there till the last day. The Karabakh doctors who came with us from Yerevan, a big group of other doctors who came from Yerevan, our doctors who came from Moscow, Noray Zakharyan. 2 days before the war ended, he had such a high spirit. Some stupid doctors living in doctors were buying assets here in Moscow. That's what their minds were occupied with. Whereas Noray Zakharyan was persuading me, let's buy a house in Shushi so that people see we have serious intentions. There was just 1 day left to go of the war. I can name all of the boys: Gregory, Karapetyan, Grisha, Trauma, Surgeon Armen Petrosyan, Atomter Grigoryan. He attended to everyone. He knew where everything was. He knew all the stuff, all the nurses, all the doctors. Very warm-spirited person, Atomter Grigoryan is. A lot of people are still there, present here online. Armen, Hagopjanian, Gregory, Khatchatourov, David Barserian from Mongol doctors. He worked there 44 days with his head down, didn't utter a single word. Day and night he's a microsurgeon from Yerevan. Without any pathetic statements, without asking or requiring anything. Everyone was like that. I saw that, well, in general, any war is an impetus for development of medical science. I felt that the capacity of local doctors wasn't so big. It's a matter of experience. Those doctors who went through the first war, they were more experienced and they were there, but there was a big chunk of younger doctors who have not witnessed the first war and they had problems orienting themselves. But during week 2 and 3, they already acquired pretty good experience and could navigate. You mentioned the upsides, but there were also downsides, maybe negative omissions that also have to be flagged. We'll reflect on that. Let me add one more thing. As for PTSD, of course, that syndrome does exist first and foremost. To a lesser degree, it pertains to doctors, because it seems to me that people who have succeeded to reevaluate their entire potential capacity, their internal power, and just left and went far, far away and got all the way to Stepanakert, they are mentally very sound. I think you have to treat first and foremost those people who succeeded having this pain, still refrain from this condition. They just knew that the war will be over and they will remain on the sidelines. They need to be treated. That's a matter of conscience, if you want my opinion. It boils down to conscience. This fits perfectly within the dilemma that those doctors first and foremost must be professional, and secondly, they must empathize. They must have the heart. And this fits within 2 paradigms: education first and upbringing second. Well, education comes without saying. It's very difficult, both with education and upbringing, to, in dire social economic conditions, it's very difficult to have them up to standard the way we would have liked. There's a lot still left to do. You know what? I accept that, especially the issue of the conscience. It's up to their conscience who behaved how back then. If we talk about the trauma and the post-traumatic stress syndrome, no one is ready to go out and fight there. If you wind yourself up, you're still never ready for what you're gonna encounter and witness there. This was a submerged issue, the PTSD. It's not on the surface. So if you look at the advice of psychologists and psychiatrists, they advise to speak up. If something is torturing you, if something seems not right, you have to talk about it with the specialist, because it may get worse if you keep it submerged, if you revert to avoidance tactics, if you're ashamed, if you don't identify it. But you have to talk about it, and you have to bring it to the surface and resolve it. It's a serious issue. We have a great percentage of the population who suffer from this, and psychologists are working on this. What were the most important lessons you learned? Or just one lesson? During this war, the most important lesson was that I understood one more time that the spiral reiterates itself. We're living in a region, we do not have mineral resources. Everything's either in our head or on the surface. It's in our, everything we have is in our hearts, our heads, and we can't afford to sit down and just fear and do nothing. We have to get accustomed to treat this fear differently. We have to completely reinvent ourselves. We need to develop some sort of a code, a professional medical Armenian code, and involving the entire diaspora. The diaspora has every potential, whether by law or by their obligations, should unite with the entire Armenian nation and people and arrive at a decision as to how to overcome the situation. This will repeat itself, and we have to always be ready, not to treat what we're doing as something heroic, a feat that we just went out there. No, this should be a routine attitude towards our motherland, our nation. If, God forbid, a month down the road, parvovirus or in Tavush, I will get up and go there and do whatever I can. You have to treat it as a routine duty. You have to, when our society, when our nation needs it, you have to get out of your comfort zone immediately. And put aside your private affairs and, as they say, address more serious national agenda. Thank you, Shagen. There's a doctor online who's somewhat different from all of us. He's done all this twice. I'm talking about Gevorg. He's taken part in the first Artsakh war, and during this war he was in field hospitals. And Gevorg will tell you, quote unquote, he also was privileged to get wounded himself. Gevorg, please tell us. Let's start with the first question. Let me tell you, our family never encountered that dilemma, to go or not to go, or to approve or not to approve. There was goodwill throughout. My wife herself is a doctor, and she understood the sensitivity of the situation. Moreover, when unfortunately I didn't succeed to take part in the second war because I had to take care of my wife. She had a grave medical condition. My elder son left for the war this time, and even in his family that issue never emerged. His wife Mariam never impeded with his decision. Moreover, his mother, that is my wife, never said, do not go. Unfortunately, there were doctors all the way from the first war when we were making a draw and deciding to go or not to go. Someone said, my mom doesn't allow me. It was a person with his own family. Well, God would be his judge. I'm not throwing any stones. From the psychological perspective, I think that in order to overcome the PTSD, a person has to be A doctor, of course, first and foremost, especially in our profession, you have to be tough in the spirit, you have to be stable, but there are also people who succumb to panic. Doctors who yield to panic, they orient themselves worse in difficult, tough situations, and there are doctors who have only done planned surgeries that go smoothly. But when a need emerges to be more flexible, of course, it comes only with experience. And another feature that I think is of preeminent importance in dealing with PTSD, it's the sense of humor. The sense of humor helps out a lot, I have to say, during the war. I can recall during this most recent war, we had Janik, traumatologist from Schengen Center. We never heard, no one was complaining, of course. Among us, there was no conflict, no discord, even no discontent. Whether, I mean, the tension is there and it leads to psychological alienation or proximity. But Janik, at the toughest moment, would come see we're doing a surgery. He said, "What could I do to interfere? Just stand next to us and interfere." So from the very first summons, he knew what he should do to the limbs of this or that patient. During the first war, we worked in a much broader scope, general surgeons. There was just one traumatologist for a brief period. Everything from urology, from maxillary facial, everything was on the shoulders of a general surgeon. This time we had maxillofacial surgeon. He took care of all problems with the head. We had traumatologists, 2 people who were dealing with the limbs. And we had general surgeons who did thoracic and abdominal surgeries. And one has to say that this time, in the past war, we didn't have echo, sonographs, x-rays, or lab tests. This time we had a lab, x-ray service, sonograph, which gave hope to the wounded, although they didn't really know what they needed or didn't. But diagnostics wise, we cut down the times a lot. Go ahead, please. As for the toughest moment that I lived through, for me, the gravest moment was when, during performing surgery, I understood that the patient was already gone. You keep working by momentum, sheer inertia, and then you see there is an incision, but there is no hemorrhage. The blood circulation has stopped. It's a cardiac arrest. We try to resuscitate, of course, but that moment when you leave the patient already on the table and has to leave absolutely disillusioned. This was not the war like Tolstoy mentions in his, Leo Tolstoy mentions in his Sebastopol stories. He says this was not the war with timpani, with the cavalry and the nice ranks. We saw cruelty, we saw death, we saw suffering, which was a torture both for us and for the wounded. After the war, they proposed that I read a very interesting book by Vladimir Sarokov, Shockwave, What to Do. It was a brilliant book, highly professionally written, with all the way from the roots of terrorism in 18th, 19th century, all the way through the minute professional issues that he examined chapter over chapter. He went through the Chechen war. He is, of course, a doctor, and all of the trials and tribulations of contemporary war and the types of casualties and injuries. During the past war, it was mostly firearm wounds back then. the cluster bombs were the BB balls, and the most dangerous were the eccentric bullets that could enter the leg and come out of the chest. This time we only saw firearm wounds closer to the end of the war. Everything was explosive wounds, all the way from the head, the eyes, all the way through the abdomen, the chest. Of course, you can organize everything and navigate during the surgery. There were doctors who said that they removed the spleen from the chest, they sewed up and sutured a lung from the abdomen, accessing it from the abdomen. But this panic, and the soldiers also succumb to panic sometimes. You mentioned that humor had a protective role in such situations. Humor may not only helps, but it also is a protective response. Many years ago, after the events in Getachen, when we, the three doctors, were moved to the Ganja prison, there was violence, we were beaten up, international organizations freed up, we became POWs. How long did you stay? 17 days. Valery Khatchatourov and Sarkis Hagopjanian and myself. The three of us were captured. The Soviet soldiers captured us and handed over to the Azeris, and they took us away. That's not what matters. What matters is that several years down the road in Yerevan, a major conference international was organized about the psychosociological condition of victims of torture, and I delivered a lecture there. And what made it special was that I was considered both an victim, a subject of study, and an author, a researcher. So when I completed my communication, it was dead silence. They never heard or experienced anything like that. There was, from the Danish Red Cross, Inge Gelefke, he said, you know what? I can tell you that only 4 or 5 years down the road, the psychological aberrations or among the doctors emerge out of the suffering. I laughed and I said, it's been 4.5 years. I haven't noticed any aberrations yet or abnormalities. He said, you have a good sense of humor. Even years down the road, humor should prevail. Gevorg, where did you get wounded? If you, of course, want to tell us about it. The book saved my life. Love for reading saved me. On November 6th, with Armen on day 1, we left there. We went through several hospitals. They were shelling one. We moved to another. Toch, Karmishuka, Kaartsin. They were not hospitals. They were like makeshift in the buildings. I was always at the frontline hospitals. But during that war and during this war, we were initially in the Jabrail hospital. It was shelled. We moved to Toch. In Toch, it was an art school that we converted to the hospital. Then we moved to Karmishuka, converted the school building into a hospital. Once they were shelling, there was no more hope to stay there. We moved. In Artin on November 6th, the morning was quiet. There was no influx of. But we heard the whistle, the terrible sound of the shelling that was approaching. So there were no patients. I lied down on the bed. We had beds there. The first night, 2 nights, we slept on the floor in the church. But then we redeployed and there were beds. We all had the experience that you should never lie down next to a window or glass, because the first thing that shatters is glass during shelling. So usually I put my head against the wall and the feet towards the window. I tried to put my head to the window so that there would be light and I could read. I took the book and started reading. I didn't finish it, unfortunately. It was about the tundra in pre-revolutionary Russia. There was a German traveler who went through the tundra, Yamal, Siberia, and wrote a book of his memoirs about the lifestyles of the locals. I was reading this book and then I suddenly felt that this whistle, this horrible noise is approaching of the, but there is this word that if you hear it, it's not meant for you. I heard it and it was meant for me. A huge wall a huge, the wall crumbled on me. Had I put up my head against the wall, I would have ended under the rubble. This time, it was only my chest and my head remained outside and my right hand. So reading a book saved me. Had my head been oriented as usual towards the wall, all the rocks would have crumbled. So you were injured? Yes, my ribs were broken, pneumothorax, the lung were compressed, and other minor things. There was another doctor that got wounded. Yes, that's what I was getting to. From the same explosion, Edgar was wounded. A surgeon from Hagopjanian. He was outside. He was saved because he was standing behind the transformer, just accidentally. So there was a fragment that got him from the back. They didn't remove it. It was too close to the vital organs. Thank goodness he is okay. He's working. I spent several days at the hospital and got back to work thereafter. You're a unique person going through all this, reading a book about tundra in that situation. I have to thank you in person. You're the first person who allowed me to perform my own surgery. Yeah, those were the happy years, long gone. I was still a student back then. Thank you, Gevorg. John. Gregory, you're now in Geneva. In Switzerland, you left the good life in Switzerland and came to Artsakh, de facto arrived at war. So the same question, how did your family take this? I know incidentally that as far as I remember, you were the penultimate person who was evacuated from the Stepanakert hospital, if I'm not mistaken. Shagen was the last, you were the one before last. No, that's wrong. I'll start from afar. For the first time, my experience in such grave situations was back in 1988, the earthquake. I was a young doctor back then. I didn't have any experience, but I still went there. And I understood two things there. I was able to help very little. I helped my friends. I was already in Switzerland there. I helped them only because they were tired. I just pushed ahead their daily work a little bit. I understood that if you're not really meaningfully useful in those situations, you should not go there because you're wasting resources. And apart from that, not being useful is one thing, but you could even cause some damage or harm. That was my first experience, which is why during the first Karabakh war, I did not go. I was a young doctor just learning. I was not in a position to be meaningfully helpful. This time, when the war broke out, within those 2 weeks, like Shagen said, it seemed to us that it wasn't going to be like this. And when I understood that was not the case and voices came from Armenia calling for help, I understood that I should go, because if there's demand for my professionalism there, I cannot just sit here with my arms folded and carry on business as usual. I couldn't even work normally. As for how the family took it, frankly speaking, I can't say. I told them I'm going to Armenia. I didn't specify that I'm traveling to Karabakh from Armenia. During through Armenic, I approached the ministry to really understand whether they need a vascular surgeon on the spot or not. There was a Zoom meeting with the ministry coordinator, and a week, 10 days later, they told me, yes, there is a need for this. I packed up and came to Armenia. They proposed that I go to Goris. That was the last weeks already. I understood that there was nothing to do in Goris for me. It was just a transit outpost. The patients were either operated on at the front line in Karabakh, then where they moved through Goris and were transported to Yerevan. So there was nothing to do in Goris. I said, take me to where there is work to do. They asked me, will you agree to go to Stepanakert? I said, I didn't come here to drink coffee. Let's go. The road already then was closing intermittently. It was difficult. So I got to the Republican Hospital of Stepanakert. Shagen already told you that about that hospital a couple of words. I would like to fill in. The most important thing is that today's medicine must be as specialized as possible, provide specialized assistance ASAP, as close to the front line as possible. And this hospital delivered exactly that. They had an ER which worked perfectly. They had anti-shock box. They had computer tomography next to it. And the patients were moved to the surgical theater if necessary. They moved the surgical theater into the basement. You know, that hospital was also shelled. Yeah, they went down into the bunkers. The maternity ward was shelled. Yeah, and I bow to those doctors who more than 40 days lived, ate, slept there, where there were no bedding. They just slept on the floor and worked. They didn't lose their human face. This human dimension and experience was the best that I learned. They didn't lose their human face and features. Brilliant people, nurses, orderlies, anesthesiologists, who simply, this wouldn't have been possible without them. So I worked like that approximately for a week until the catastrophic evacuation that Shagen also referred to. That's how it was. There were two young vascular surgeons, one from the Stepanakert hospital, the other from North-Marash, who's been there for quite a while. So I felt useful there. If I were to take the same decisions today, I would have gone earlier. I wouldn't have waited for the approval of the demand. I would have left earlier, of course. Did you make it to play some soccer there? Did you play football with the boys there? Because they were showing it everywhere. In a brief interval of the shelling, Armen Minassian and all the doctors went out, made up a team and played football together. I wasn't in the football team, but I was going out and walking around Shushi. I wanted to go to the downtown Stepanakert. The hospital was further away, but they summoned us over the radio to the hospital when there were vascular issues. I didn't have much free time. How shall I put it? The important thing is that the doctors who go there, they need to have a day or two to adapt first. You need to adapt to understand who's doing what, where, and how. That's very important to begin with. And secondly, the medicine that we do, civilian medicine that we do every day is not the same as military medicine. Military medicine is, like I said, you have to be able to provide specialized assistance, save life, save functions, and you put on the scales, resources, people, doctors who are available, the existing capacity to do something. Then you need to think about who's going to take care of those people, resuscitation, transportation. All of these is a balancing game that shifts with every hour. You may have many patients and the equation changes. In order to take those decisions, you need a little time to adapt. And it's very important for the doctors to be experienced ones. Those questions are very sensitive, very sophisticated, but they come easy to experience the doctors compared to the younger ones. It's very important. What was your toughest decision? My toughest decision, the bitter one that will be my albatross. During that catastrophic evacuation when a young guy was being operated. His vein and his artery at the leg was cut at the basis. 24 hours have gone by. The leg couldn't be saved, I thought. But when we restored the veins and moved to arteries and then onwards to nerves, the anesthesiologist told me that we are being urgently evacuated. So shut this down. That was the gravest, the toughest for me experience. As for the PTSD, when you work as a doctor, you will not experience any special trauma. And that applies to the daily life. When you lose a patient and you think it's through your error, it stays with you. I remember every patient I lost, each and every one of them to this day. And it's the same. When you start working, when you get onto the track, the issue does not emerge. Everyone, you work like you should, you know what should be done, you know what you're doing and whatnot. It seems to me, I haven't been at the front line like Gevorg under shelling. That may be somewhat different. I worked, give or take, one may say, in normal conditions. We heard the shells coming. We worked accompanied by that background noise. But I worked in an environment that was not dissimilar to my daily routine. They brought this patient, they took away the other one. The penultimate day was very hard because since 6 in the morning all the way to 6 in the afternoon, 145 wounded persons arrived. Not everyone was in grave condition, but there were days like that as well. Very tense. But everyone worked without complaining. So the work went on, which is why it was very bitter when the summons for evacuation came. The work flew like it should have. It was a very difficult experience, this evacuation. Since you recall the PTSD, let me recall that your sister in Geneva is also a psychologist. She also comes over here, works, helps the wounded and the peaceful population who went through the trauma of war. And let's thank her specifically for that. The PTSD, of course, affects the military servicemen and the civilians who underwent the horrors of war at the front line. Yes, it's undeniably there. It's a very serious issue for those who have lost a limb or amputated or are disabled. It's very important to work with them. And in general, for us Armenians today, for all of us, it's more of a general condition. We have to reevaluate, we have to analyze everything to know where to go from here. Thank you. Armen, before giving the floor to you, I know that you will also, and I have to ask you to briefly tell you about the initiative of yours, the International Foundation. I would like to mention several other initiatives that have done a lot of work and continue to do it. Some of those I have to mention. The Viva Foundation from Russia, Armenian Wounded Soldiers Foundation from USA, UCLA University initiatives. There are individual initiatives. For example, a woman psychologist who volunteered and works with the soldiers and the evacuees. The association in France, Santé Arménie, traveling doctors, the Aurora laureates, Aurora Initiatives works with various organizations and implements projects. Our Idea Foundation and the field organization has set up a task force with UCLA for physical and psychological rehab. Once we've surveyed the scene, we're ready to work with the stakeholders. And there are many other similar initiatives out there. For me, one thing is clear, that the war brought to the surface all of the systemic issues, exposed them, that exist also, among others, in the health sector. The crisis that we are in now must make us fully rethink diaspora Armenia and Armenia diaspora relations. The old model no longer delivers, if you want my opinion, and we can come out of this crisis only working together in a new format, of course. That's my opinion, if you want it. Armen, please. I would like to bow to everyone involved. That which the doctors did doesn't fit into any four corners. That which Gevorg Grigoryan told, everything he went through. Shagen is the most intellectual doctor. He only cursed 3 times, used foul language. Everyone else were doing it every 3rd minute. So when Gevorg told us humor saved us from PTSD, that was a real lifesaver. Not only for all of us there, but also for the locals, because there are people who stayed behind, all the nurses, all the janitors, orderlies. They either had a brother, a kid, or a spouse who was out there fighting, and they didn't get any news from the front line. Every minute they were expecting some piece of bad news, because they was bringing someone in every other minute. So they were bringing 2 or 3 people every day who turned out to be the child, the father, the spouse of one of the nurses. And they were glad. They wept, but they were glad the person was alive. The head was injured, the leg was injured, but doesn't matter, he was alive. The people who were living, and I don't know, will continue to work, hopefully in Stepanakert, they were living in those conditions for 30 years running. To put it bluntly, we came from afar, helped, looked around and left. They were very glad, but the first time when all of us were living for Yerevan, Shahen mentioned everyone, but he forgot to mention several people who were not doctors, but were by our side. Yura, Jurian, Gagi, Grigoryan, who went back and forth. They brought food for us. These people who, when the first ceasefire was announced, when we played football that day, we were hoping life will return. They came and told us everyone goes back to Yerevan for a couple of days of rest. And the most horrible thing that you saw was that the locals who already were friends with us embraced us. We drank coffee every day. We didn't have much choice to eat. It was either coffee or some cookies from Russia. I've never eaten so much Russian cookies in my life as I did in Stepanakert those days. Those people were amazed. Why all doctors went up and left? The war is not over yet. And Atom der Grigoryan, the doctor, he was somewhat, he treated this differently. When we came to Goris, he wanted to hit the bed. We maybe haven't slept for a couple of weeks, every one of us. We were all sleepy in the car. Atom told us, I would like to stay put here in Goris. I would like to see a couple of my patients. Yura said, no, we're all going to Yerevan. No, Atom said, I'm staying in Goris. Okay. He stays there to consult a couple of patients. He left Goris. He and Atom just drove back to Stepanakert straight away. I think this feeling that we all had, that whether it was a sense of duty or a decision one took, it's impossible to teach this feeling. It must be ingrained in a person. My grandfather was 16 when the war broke out, the Second World War. He decided when he was 16 to go fight the Germans. And our family was big. No one was able to stop him. He went when he was 16. He came back 5 years down the road with the rank of a captain at 21. Not an easy feat. This feeling that I was always proud of with my grandpa, it has to be embedded in you. You just decide, you get up and go. You asked me, how did your family take this? Most of them didn't know. They didn't know because my dad or my mother could have prevented me. They would have come with me to Stepanakert had they known. When I talked to my wife about going, and my junior son knew, the elder didn't, my wife tried to talk me out of it. Something may happen. And I brought my life insurance paperwork. There's a big my friends keep joking, you cost more dead than alive, they tell me. I gave this paper to my wife. If something happens, here's the paperwork. She tore it up and told me, get back. This was better insurance for me, thinking about the future, than any other. So you are your own employment. You gave yourself a vacation and went to Artsakh. I have 4 surgeons working for me, and all the surgeries are planned 2 months in advance. The patients are lined up. It was almost impossible to call an American patient and tell them, you know what, we have to defer your surgery for 2 more months. My office manager went through an ordeal. I don't know what was his rationale, how he was explaining the patients as to where Dr. Hagopjanian was. But the American surgeons who worked with me, they just stood up. They understood what was transpiring. And they helped me a lot, those 4 surgeons. Private practice, it was our business, our own business. And if we turn down 200 surgeries, that's a major blow for all of us. But they all said, yes, we're with you, go and do what you should. You went to Stepanakert, if I can remember, for the first time with the Russian quiz show team, KVN. No, the team didn't go there, all of them, to Stepanakert, but that was something related to this. They already knew us very well. In the KVN team, there were very few doctors, although we were called. We were representing the Yerevan Medical University. Nevertheless, there are many friends who were trying to get involved in medicine-related issues, but like Dr. Khatchatourov said, at the front line, you need professionals. When we come, we should not try and present ourselves as knowing what to do. No, we didn't know what to do. We shouldn't have done medicine. We should have just entertained. Like Gevorg said, humor is saved in the early 90s. Apart from taking the decision to go, all the close friends knew. I brought with me 9 huge trunks with instruments, with medications and everything else. So the first issue was, how are we going to get this through the customs in Los Angeles, in Paris, how they will accept this in Yerevan. My junior son withdrew to his room for an hour. He made these big signs in English, French, and Armenian. Please let these medications pass through because it's meant for wounded soldiers in Armenia. And imagine, I was very surprised. All 9 big trunks arrived seamlessly, without any problems. Shagen said that, yes, we did make friends. I'm grateful for this beautiful experience that I brought along. Why beautiful? Because I saw how people converge into a fist. We didn't know each other before, but right away, you just break bread once and know that you've already spent 100 years together. It's a very beautiful experience. It's very difficult to acquire friends in your lifetime, but in a couple of days, you already understand your brothers. You share everything. You care about them. We were passing by a window. Gevorg said windows are the most hazardous. Everyone was pulling you away immediately. Don't stand by the window, they're shelling. When you get accustomed to the sound of the shelling, you don't even want to get in. They snatch you, they get you in, they tell you you're losing your fear already. So you grow spiritually within 24 hours, professionally. you already have to acquire new approaches. You mentioned there were lots of initiatives. This internal nation came about not because we all of a sudden thought about it. Every day after surgeries, after talking to each other, this Russian team that came, Shagen mentioned just about everyone, we decided things need to change. That which we were doing didn't work. Why weren't we ready for this? Why weren't we ready for proper approaches? Why nothing was ready top down? We realized everything has to be put in place by ourselves on charity grounds. You have to bring it all together. You refer to the Viva Fund, the Armenian Wounded Heroes Fund. We all work together, internal nation. We work with all of them. We all coordinate our efforts so that not to avoid overlaps, so that everyone does what they do best. That's very important. It matters. If you remember, when we talked with Gevorg, we talked about young doctors who came and helped. We even saw them in Stepanakert. There was this boy who came. Every day he was helping us out in the operation, in the theater, but it showed that he had nothing to do with it. Apparently he was a dermatologist, as we later learned, but he came with a big heart to help. And that truly matters for people to come in good faith to help. But on the other hand, you have to be ready for a team to be deployed and help. This is not where you have to start teaching what needs to be done. The front line, during the war, Stepanakert was the biggest hospital, the Republican one. That's not where you have to start acquiring the skills. You have to come there and get right down to business, knowing what needs to be done. One of the toughest days was when the culture club in Shushi was shelled. Immediately, a lot of people, when the police officers had a meeting there, they were all black. It was not only fragments of shells, but the building that collapsed over them, it imploded. It was like an earthquake victims, because people, they had stone fragments, they had dirt in their wounds. You didn't know whether to wash the wounds or to amputate to save the life, or what needs to be. Those were very hard days. And in those moments, you really had to be an accomplished professional. There was no time to think. 80 people arrive. You have to treat them one after the other, get them into the operation theater and operate quickly. Let me mention one thing, Armen. You said something very appropriate and reminded me of this finer point. One thing that needs to be taken into the account by all means, apart from us having neighbors like we do, it's common knowledge that Armenia is also in a seismically active zone. Recently, we had a reminder of that in Yerevan. So the health sector must have systems and procedures, state-of-the-art internationally. I think I'll fill in what you said. Casualties that were sustained similar to the earthquake by those soldiers that you referred. What was the biggest lesson you learned? That we were late. That was the lesson. I keep talking about this lesson for a long time. The PTSD that you keep referring to. I keep talking, and if I talk about PTSD, I will never quit. But I believe that we were late. We were late a lot in preparing our doctors and paramedics. We are not ready. We have to change that what we're doing. We need to adopt a different attitude. We're living in a place where everything can repeat. I do not understand those people who stand up for the status quo, who tell us don't say these things. Everything is normal in Armenia. Our health system is the best in the world and whatnot. We have to decide, either we change, and if we change, the whole situation has to, or we decide that, you know what, let's leave everything as is. maybe we get lucky and we no longer witness another war. That's not the way to live in. We all have to understand that things have to be changed. I agree with you, by all means. And of course, if the situation changes, you have to change with it. You have no other choice, whether you want it or not. What matters is to talk straight about every problem and issue. By putting them under the rug, nothing will be resolved. And let me reiterate that the relations between the diaspora and Armenian diaspora have to be rethought head to toe. In every sector, if we take medicine, people came, performed surgeries, left, brought in pharmaceuticals, brought in an MRI scanner. That has to change, has to be reviewed. This is work that needs to be done. There is no other alternative. We will not have another opportunity. This has to be done. You know, our time expired. It's been exactly an hour that flew by. I would like to address this to the future doctors who are listening to us as we speak. Being a doctor is a service. Living for others is a dignified, worthy life. There is no higher objective than to serve others. We, the doctors, are happy and privileged because in our work, we never would leave home by the end of the day thinking that we haven't done anything of value. I address this to the future doctors. I want you to get inspired and draw lessons from the toil of these people and their dedication and devotion. Who knows, one day you may become like them, one of them. I want to thank all of you for finding the time. This 1 hour, I know how difficult it is for a doctor to find this 1 hour. Thank you for sharing with us, and I thank everyone in the audience. Be healthy. All the best. Thank you. And we wish you, Dr. Minassian, the same. Let everyone know that you're a doctor too. Thank you. All the best.